taking care of our fuzzy feline friends so they don't starve to death. Today we're beating shortages by making our own DIY canned cat food. Meow. Hey guys, it's Jara with Wicked Prepared. Welcome back to our channel. If you're not already subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, give us a big thumbs up, and say hi down in the comments because it really helps us out. Today we are dealing with a problem. How many of my friends out there have cats in their household? And if you have a cat, how are the cat food shelves looking in your local grocery store? There is a massive cat food shortage, especially with canned cat food. And this is unlike any other shortage that we've been seeing. I've heard from people all over the country how bad it is everywhere, and it doesn't come and go like some of the shortages we've seen. At least in my area, the shelves have been completely bare for a very long time. It started with canned cat food, but lately I've noticed the supplies of dry cat food are dwindling as well. It's becoming very concerning. Sometimes we just need to take things into our own hands and reduce our dependence on the grocery stores and the supply chain. So today we're going to make homemade canned cat food. When I decided I wanted to make canned cat food, I started doing a lot of research. There's a lot of recipes out there on Pinterest, on Facebook, all over the internet, and people see these recipes and say, oh, that looks so healthy, and with the best of intentions, they mix up food for their cat or dog. But those foods are not always the best and most appropriate foods for a cat or a dog because their nutritional needs are different. What sounds healthy to you or I might not be best for your cat or dog. The recipe I settled on came from an article I found that was written by a veterinarian, and this woman was very, very thorough. She gave really good reasoning for the ingredients that she used and didn't use and why. I'm going to put a link to that article down in the description in case you want to look at it yourself. It was definitely very thorough. It's very long. It took me several days to really get through it and digest it. But it's a great article, and if you have any questions about why things are done the way that they are, if you want to make any kind of substitutions or changes, or if your cat has any kind of different health considerations, you might want to go take a look at the article. But I'm going to break it down and make it pretty simple, and we're going to make up some home canned cat food. Now the ingredients we're going to use are pretty simple. We are using chicken leg quarters and chicken livers, vitamin E, vitamin B complex 50, taurine, Morton iodized light salt, and a fish oil. This particular fish oil that I chose is a pump that's made specifically for dogs and cats, but you could also use fish oil capsules that you take for yourself and just open them up and squeeze them into the mixture. One great thing about all of these supplements is that with the exception of the fish oil, which is for dogs and cats, all of these are human supplements. So if I don't use them all out making cat food, I can add them to our medicine cabinet. Alright, so here I've got my chicken leg quarters. You'll have to excuse the condition of my pan. I even gave it some extra elbow grease today to get it camera ready. But this pan is very well loved and very well used in our house. Now each single batch of this cat food uses 3 pounds of chicken legs. I've got about 6 pounds here, a little bit over. I'm going to make a double batch. So for each single batch you need 3 pounds of chicken legs and 3 ounces of the chicken livers. But you'll notice that I have removed the skin from just the drumstick portion of these leg quarters. Now, the skin is how we're going to control the fat. The skin has a lot of the fat in it. And by taking off some of the skin, we can remove some of the fat. Now, cats do need fat in their diet, just like any other creature. And she goes into more detail on how she decides how much fat to leave in the food if you read the article. But basically, if you have cats that are underweight, you can leave a little bit more fat in their food, and if you have cats that are overweight, you should remove a little bit more fat from the food. We have 6 cats in our household, and they're varying weights. Some are very, very slender, probably underweight, and some are a little bit chunky. So I've removed part of the skin to make sort of a more balanced fat content. We're also leaving the bones in because the bones are going to be included in the food, and I'll talk more about that later. But what I'm going to start by doing is baking these until they're mostly cooked. Now, obviously, when you pressure can meat, it cooks in the canner. So these could actually be done raw. What I'm going to start by doing is baking these in the oven until they're mostly done. I'm going to use a temperature of 375, but that really doesn't matter too much. Whatever you would typically bake your bone-in chicken at, go ahead and bake these till they're mostly done. So while the chicken's cooking, let's talk a little bit more about the bones. Now, if you happen to have a meat grinder that can handle bones, and I'll link a few down in the description that should be able to handle bones, but I don't have one. If you do, you don't even have to cook the chicken to begin with because you can grind it up bone and all. I'm cooking it so that I can remove the meat easily from the bones because I have a different way that I'm going to grind the bones. We are going to incorporate some of the bone in the finished cat food. And we are making canned cat food, so it's going to be shelf stable. And when you pressure can meat, it cooks in the canning jar. So you really don't have to cook it first. I'm just doing that so that I can remove it from the bones. And what I'm going to do is pressure cook those bones through several cycles until they crumble. And at that point, they're safe to include in the food. They won't hurt your cat when they're all crumbled up. If you don't have a meat grinder that can handle the bones, and you also don't have a pressure cooker, or you don't want to do that, you can include bone meal in place of including the bones from the chicken. And I'll put that down in the description, the amounts of bone meal that you would use. But it's actually much better to use the real bones from the meat. Using the bone in the finished cat food helps them get calcium, and we're going to adjust the amount of meat and bone to get the proper calcium to phosphorus ratio. The calcium comes from the bone, the phosphorus comes from the meat. If you want to learn more about that, go ahead and read the article that I've put down in the description, but I'll explain a little bit more as we go along. So now that the chicken's done cooking, I'm just going to let it cool a little bit until it's cool enough for me to remove the meat from the bones, and then we'll proceed with making our cat food. I'm going to leave all those nice juices in the pan for now because we're going to add them to our finished cat food. There's a lot of flavor and fat and good things like that in that juice. So now what I'm doing now that the chicken has cooled off a little bit is I'm going to take all the meat off the bones and the skin that we left on it, and I'm going to be putting it into my the bowl of my food processor. I did have to go change into a more appropriate top and throw on an apron. Now remember, we're saving the bones because we're going to process those as well to add to the cat food. And like I mentioned before, it does not matter if this is completely cooked through. I did test it with my meat thermometer and it did test done. But I was just interested in making sure that I would be able to get the meat from the bones. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate out the bone of the drumstick, and I'm not going to include those when I process the bones for the cat food, because it's important to have the proper meat to bone ratio so that you have a proper calcium to phosphorus ratio. And I think that I'd rather err on the side of a little less bone. So I think that leaving out these drumstick bones will be a good idea. So now I've got chicken meat in my food processor. Now, I learned from me, don't make my mistake, have your food processor bowl seated on the base before you start filling it up. I should have thought of that before I got started, but this is about half of the meat. I'm gonna have to do this in 2 batches, but remember I've got 2 batches worth of meat here. So this is about a single batch, which is 3 pounds of chicken. Now I'm gonna add to this, I do have 1 batch worth of liver. I have 3 ounces of the liver in there. I took about half of the juices from the pan, and I'm going to add a cup of water into this. You can add at least a cup. You can add more if you need to get a consistency you want, like a pate type of consistency. And it actually can be better for the cats to have more water in it. So if your cats will accept it, you can add more water. I found something very interesting when I was researching this cat food project, that it's actually healthiest for cats to eat a canned food diet rather than a dry kibble diet. Our cats eat mostly dry kibble. So now I'm rethinking what I do for them. And the reason that is because in the wild, cats are not naturally inclined to drink a lot of water in addition to their food. They get a lot of the water they need from the food that they eat. And so cats who live indoors and eat primarily dry kibble tend to be chronically dehydrated, and that can cause them a lot of health problems. So this has got the cup of water plus some of the juices that baked out. And I'm gonna get this going, and we're gonna blend this up into a pate consistency. Take a look at this and see what it's, wow, that's actually looking a lot like cat food. Wow, that really has a great cat food consistency. I'm going to bring you in so that you can see what this is looking like. I'm going to let it go a little bit longer, but that's already looking pretty good. Now keep in mind, this is only half of the chicken, and I haven't added any of the supplements, and I haven't added the bone yet, because I'll show you in just a minute what we're going to do with the bones. I have to blend up the other half of this, but what I did was I took off the drumstick portion of the bone and set that aside. And then also at the top of each piece of thigh, these are leg quarters, and I don't know if they always have this. I think they probably do, but it had this other kind of random piece of bone at the very top of the thigh, right up here. And I also took that off because that just looks like it has maybe some spine in it and things that are going to have a higher bone to meat ratio, and we don't want that. So I took that bone out. So all I have here is just the bone of the thigh. And it's okay if you don't get all the meat off of this bone, because we are going to process this and incorporate this into our finished food. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this all processed down, and then we're going to process the bones, and then we're going to mix it all together with the supplements and make one big full mixture, and then we're going to can it up. Okay, so I have blended up the other half of the chicken with the other 3 ounces of liver. Now remember, the liver does not have to be cooked before it's blended, because this is all going to cook during the canning process. I only cook the chicken to be able to work with the meat a little bit more easily. But this is all blended up. Another cup of water and all the rest of the pan juices as well. It's really a lovely canned cat food consistency. And what I'm doing is I'm putting it into this bowl. I kind of overjudged the size of the bowl. I probably didn't need a bowl quite this big, but I'm putting this into this bowl to keep it so I can refrigerate it while I deal with processing the bones until it's all ready to be mixed together. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is to get the bones processing. So I've got my Instant Pot insert, and I've got all the thigh bones I collected, and I'm putting them right in the Instant Pot along with 1.5 cups of water. And I'm going to process these. They may need several cycles of 4 hours to get to the point that they're crumbly. Remember, we're processing them to get them to the point that they break down and crumble so that they won't splinter. If you have a meat grinder that is capable of grinding bones, you don't have to do this step. You could grind the raw meat with the bones right in it and completely bypass this step. If you don't have an Instant Pot, you could also use a regular pressure cooker that is not electric. And I do believe if you boil these bones long enough on the stovetop, you'll get the same effect and get them to break down. But if you don't want to do any of those things, or you're unable to do any of those things, you can use bone meal. Okay, now that this is done, its first 4-hour cycle, we're going to see how these bones are doing. You can see I can just crumble them in my fingers, but I do think that maybe one more cycle would make them a little bit softer. Okay, so now that our bones have gone through 2 4-hour cycles in the Instant Pot, they are completely soft and ready to be processed for our food. Now, if you don't have an Instant Pot, you can use a non-electric pressure cooker. Even your stovetop canner can usually be used as a pressure cooker. And if you don't have any other option, if you simmer these bones for quite a while, it should have the same effect. It may take up to 24 hours, but you should be able to do that to soften these bones. So I'm going to strain these out. Now remember, we want everything that was in there because there was a little bit of meat left on the bones, and I'm going to show you just how easily that completely just macerates in my hands. I can break the bones up with my hands. So they're completely safe now to be ground up and fed to an animal. And these bones are so full of good nutrients. They've got calcium, all sorts of minerals, they've got collagen, chondroitin and glucosamine, all sorts of things are in these bones that are good for our animals. So I'm just going to put these through my trusty Cuisinart food processor. And I may need some of this bone broth here to get the consistency just right to get it to process smoothly. Now remember, we want every bit of meat and skin and everything that was left on those bones when we process them. Now this is the one way that I am going to depart from the recipe that I'm using. The woman who created this recipe said she didn't use any kind of fish in her food, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but the biggest reason is that if cats have tuna, salmon, any kind of fish, they can tend to develop a taste for that to the point that they'll refuse to eat anything else, and that can become very problematic in their diet. But I also had a lot of concerns about There was a lot I heard about certain cats that are picky. It takes them a long time to adjust to a diet like this, and some of the supplements that you put in could add a flavor they might not like. So I just thought that adding just one can to this whole double batch of mackerel would give it that fishy flavor that would actually make it more palatable to the cats, so that they would be less likely to reject this food if it comes time that they have to eat it. And this is pretty cheap. This is a large size of mackerel. I got this at the Dollar Tree, and I actually purchased this before their prices went up. So this is only $1's worth of fish here. And this fish can go right in with the juice, the bones, and everything, because just like these cooked chicken bones, these bones will be soft enough to mush right up into nothing. This smells a lot like tuna fish, so it's very similar to tuna fish. So now I'm just going to blend this right up, and if I need, I can use some of this bone broth to get it to the right consistency and make sure that it gets very smooth. See how this is doing, because remember, there's all kinds of good nutrients in this bone broth as well, things that have leached out of the bones. This is looking really good. I don't see any chunks of bone or anything in here. This looks very smooth. I'm going to give it one more little whir just to be sure now that I've stirred it around. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to add this bone meal mixture into the meat puree that we already made, and then we're going to add the rest of our ingredients and our supplements. Now, just to reiterate the recipe, one batch of this cat food uses 3 pounds of chicken leg quarters. It uses 3 ounces of liver, 1 cup of water, 2 eggs, 1.5 tablespoons of fish oil, 1 vitamin E soft gel, 1/2 to 1 B complex 50 vitamin. Now the difference there is the recipe actually calls for 1 whole capsule to be added to 1 batch, but because vitamin B has sort of a strong smell, and I'm assuming it also has a strong flavor, it's possible that your cat could reject the food. So she said you can add half of the amount to start with, and then if they're okay with that, you can try adding the rest. So I am going to cut that in half, and I'm going to use 1/2 of a capsule for 1 batch just to be on the safe side. And we also need 1/2 teaspoon of taurine powder and 1 teaspoon of Morton light iodized salt. So that's the ingredients for 1 batch. Now I will have all the ingredients written out, the recipe written out down in the description box, and I'll also have links to all of the products that I used, all of the supplements that I used. Now there's a couple of other options. If you don't want to use the bones of the chicken, you don't want to deal with that, you can use bone meal powder. She stresses that it's much better for the health of the animal to use the real bones, and I didn't find that to be really too much of an extra step to do. That was really no problem at all for me to do that. But there's bone meal powder that I will link, and I'll add the optional amount of that in the recipe. And the other thing you could consider is there's a product called TC Feline, and it's basically a supplement that contains bone meal, and it contains all of these nutrients that we added. It contains all in one product, and there are 2 versions, one with liver and one without liver. Now once again, she stressed it's much better to add fresh liver to the recipe, but if you don't want to do any of that, you could consider the TC Feline. I looked at it and it's quite expensive, so I found that I would rather add the nutrients myself, because all these things are pretty inexpensive, and you may have a lot of this in your medicine cabinet already. If you take fish oil capsules, you can use those. And if you take vitamin E, you could use that. Any of these supplements that you already have, you can use right out of your medicine cabinet, and they're not too expensive to purchase. All right, so here we have the pureed meat mixture that we made previously. I'm just going to be adding our bone meal mixture to this. Bone meal and mackerel. I know that I have purchased fish flavored versions of canned cat food for my cats before from the store, and I've never had issues, so I think that this is going to be okay with the mackerel. All right, so now I'm just going to mix this in thoroughly so that we have one uniform mixture, and then we'll add our supplements. All right, that's pretty good, and it's going to be mixed more as we add in the supplements. Okay, so we already have the poultry, meat, and the liver, and the water in here. So next we're going to do eggs. Now the recipe calls for 2 eggs. Remember, I'm doubling my recipe, so everything is going to be doubled. So I'm doing 4 eggs. Now when I put eggs in anything, I usually break them into a small dish first. That way if I get any eggshell in, I can get it out and if there happens to be an egg that's gone bad, because when you have your own chickens, you never know when you find an egg somewhere how long it may have been there. So I do that even when I cook for us. So I'm going to do that now. That one's fine. One. Now remember, these eggs are raw, and that's fine. They will cook in the pressure canner. Let me get those mixed around a little bit. Break up the yolks. So they'll mix in evenly. So next I'm going to be adding 3 tablespoons of fish oil for a double batch. You could also use about 10,000 milligram fish oil capsules that you can just break open and squeeze in. 3. Now the author who developed this recipe actually recommended using fish oil capsules rather than these pumps because the capsules will last a lot longer. This can go rancid. I'm storing this in the refrigerator because that's what it calls for on the package. But I decided I would just start adding this to my dog's food every day. So it's going to get used up. So that's why I chose to use this instead of fish oil capsules. But like I said, if you take fish oil capsules or someone in your household does, you can just use those. Next, we need 1 vitamin E soft gel, and this can just be broken open and squeezed into the mixture. And I'm actually going to use 2 of those because I'm doubling the recipe. So next is the B Complex 50. Now, I was going to start with the half amount that she said, just in case the cats don't like the flavor. So half the amount would be half of one of these capsules. So since I'm doing a double batch, I'm going to use the whole capsule. Now I'm going to get some water in here because it calls for dissolving the powders in a little bit of water. And remember, you can't add too much water to this mixture really, because it's better for the cats to have more water in their food. So I've got just a little bit of water in here, and I'm just going to break this capsule open and dump the powder into the dish. And that was a little bit messy. I would definitely recommend doing that with dry hands. So next I'm going to add a teaspoon of the taurine powder. I'm going to add this right into our water here so it can dissolve. Now if you decide to go with different brands of supplements, just make sure that the amounts you get are equivalent. I tried to stick with the same brands that were recommended in the original recipe if I could, and if I couldn't, I was very careful to make sure that I was using an equivalent amount of whatever that nutrient was. And finally, we're going to be adding 2 teaspoons of the Morton light salt. Now this isn't for flavor, it's more for the nutrients which are in it, which is actually sodium, obviously, and then it has potassium chloride, and it also has iodine in it. So those are necessary ingredients for this cat food. So 2 teaspoons of that, which is double the recipe. I'm just going to make sure that these are fully dissolved in here. It's got a really bright yellow color from those B vitamins. So now that that is fully dissolved, I'm going to add this right into our mixture. And then I'm just going to start mixing this together and try to make sure that everything gets very evenly incorporated. You don't want any pockets of supplements or anything that the cat might bite into that might seem unpleasant to the cat, or that might give them an overdose of any nutrient at one time. Alright, so now that I feel confident that this is really well mixed and everything's well incorporated, I'm ready to fill my canning jars. I've got my canner on the stove behind me. Now this mixture has completely cooled, so this is not a warm or hot mixture. So I've got cold water in my canner because you want to make sure that you don't have any thermal shock. You don't want to put cold jars in a hot canner, hot jars in a cold canner, any of that. I am going to do pint jars for this. Now I mentioned that we have quite a few cats. We have 6 cats, so this is not an unreasonable amount for me to use in a day, or possibly even probably 1 feeding. So I'm going to do pint jars, but you could easily do half pints if that was a more reasonable size for your cat. Or you could even do these little quarter pints, because you want to make sure that you're going to be able to use it in a reasonable amount of time once you open it up, especially if it is an emergency and you may not have refrigeration. The thing is, the processing time for any of the smaller jars is the same as the pint jars, which never really made sense to me. I think it's just that they haven't tested the small jars. So if you have a different experience and you do different meat times on smaller jars, then you do you by all means. But I'm going to use these pint jars. Now when I open my cases of jars, I usually cut right around the plastic and lift this off. And then I keep the plastic on the bottom because I can store the jars right back in this box. And if anything were to leak for any reason, it would help contain the mess from leaking down into the things I have stored below. And I usually try to save the top because it actually can go right back over the jars and keep the dust off of them if we're storing them in the basement or anywhere that might be dusty. So I'm going to fill these just like any other canning jars with my canning funnel. And I'm just going to put this mixture down in, and I'm going to leave a headspace of about 1 inch. It's not pretty, guys, but it's cat food. Cat food usually is not very appealing looking to us humans. So that double batch of cat food gave me 7 pints of canned cat food. Now I'm going to debubble these and check for my headspace and adjust it if I need to. I have my debubbler here, but I think I'm going to try using this sort of plastic chopstick. It's plastic, so I don't have to worry about it harboring any kind of bacteria. It's actually a broken piece of a kid's cheater chopstick. So I'm just going to be going around and getting as many bubbles out as I possibly can, making sure that there's about 1 inch of headspace on every jar. You can kind of see the air bubbles around the edge. It's kind of hard to do this, but you can see them disappearing as you're pushing down. Now I'm so used to doing my freeze-dried meals in a jar, and to get those down, I tap them on the counter. And I never see anyone do that in canning, so I'm assuming that's a big no-no. But if anyone out there knows if you're able to tap these down on the counter to get out the air bubbles, let me know, because that just seems like it would be much easier, or at least something that would help. All right, so now that these are all debubbled and ready to go, we're going to just take a little bit of white vinegar and on a clean piece of paper towel, and I'm just going to wipe the rims. We're just trying to make sure that there's no residue from the meat left on the rims, no fats or oils, anything that could affect our seal. Just right on the top of that rim where the lid is going to touch the jar. Okay, and now that that's done, we're going to just put on our lids and tighten them down finger tight. And then we're going to process these for meat times, because that's what this is, it's meat. And of course, meat times is going to be 75 minutes for pints. And if you do half pints, it would be the same. If you were to do quarts, it would be 90 minutes. I'm not really sure why anyone would want to do a quart of cat food unless you have a lot of cats. All right, so I've got my canner here ready to go. Now I am going to add a splash of white vinegar into the canner water, just to make sure that we don't get any mineral buildup on our jars. And then I'm going to start loading these jars in the canner. Follow the instructions for your pressure canner. I've got 3 quarts of water down in mine. All right, so these are all set to go. Now, like I said, everything's cold. The jar contents are cold. The water is cold. The canner is cold. So I'm going to get this all situated and get this started, slowly coming up to pressure. All right, so I've got this started. We're going to let this come up to steam and let it vent for 10 minutes. And then we'll put on our weight and process for 75 minutes. That's 10 pounds of pressure for my area. You're going to want to follow the instructions on your canner for meat times. All right, so a few key points I did want to touch on while we're waiting for that canner to come up to pressure. I was a little bit intimidated when I decided to look into making my own cat food, because I know that there's a lot to it if you want to do it right. But after I did my research, it really wasn't that difficult. It didn't require as many ingredients as I thought that it would. It wasn't terribly expensive. I used the chicken leg quarters because that is about the cheapest cut of any kind of meat that you can get. Now, keep in mind, the woman who developed this recipe developed it to be a raw diet, or actually kind of a hybrid raw, half cooked diet. There's a lot of controversy about raw diets because depending on where you source your meat, you could be feeding bacteria to your cat that could make them ill. So if you're buying your meat from a supermarket like I did, it's actually better to at least partially cook your meat. I am pressure canning this because I want this to be shelf stable for emergencies. So this is going to be completely cooked regardless. But if you're just choosing to feed this right now because cat food is scarce, you have a choice whether you want to do raw, partially raw, or cooked. And you wouldn't have to pressure can it. If you're doing this for your current use right now, you could store it in your freezer in containers that are appropriate size for what you would use in a feeding for your cat. Now, the author did talk about pressure canning some of this food to have on hand for emergencies, exactly the reason that I'm doing this. She was a little concerned about the nutrients being damaged by the heat, but I did some research and most of the nutrients included I found wouldn't really be damaged by the heat, so I feel comfortable doing it this way. But if you weren't willing to take that risk, you could choose the nutritional supplement that I talked about, the TC Feline, and add it afterwards. Pressure can your cat food without any of the added nutrients and add that nutrient supplement afterwards. But I found that this way was really pretty simple. It wasn't too involved, it wasn't too expensive, and I really think that the product I ended up with looked like something that looks like commercial canned cat food, which is what I'm going for. I'm looking for a substitute for the canned cat food, which is not available these days. Not sure if you can see it, but we do have steam rising out of the vent pipe, so I've set the timer for 10 minutes to vent the canner. When the 10 minutes is up, we'll put on the pressure regulator and we will start our time. Okay, so now it's been venting for 10 minutes and it's time for me to put on my weight. This is 10 pounds of pressure for my area. And once this comes up to pressure and starts to rock, then we're going to set the timer for our processing time. A couple of points to consider while we wait for the canner to come up to pressure. Please keep in mind that I'm not a veterinarian, and if you're going to be changing your cat's diet, you should definitely consult with your veterinarian, especially if your cat has any special health concerns. The woman who developed this recipe was a veterinarian, and I feel very confident using it. I've linked the article down in the description, like I mentioned, so definitely go check it out if you want to know more about why she included what she did. She's extremely thorough. Alright, she's a jiggling, so I am going to set the timer for 75 minutes. Alright, she's a jiggling, so I'm going to set the timer for 75 minutes. Okay guys, our 75 minutes are up. Now we begin the long process of waiting for this to come down to pressure naturally. We're waiting for the button to drop down. So now that my button is down, I'm going to remove my weight. And then I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes before I open it up. Okay, so I'm ready to take my jars out. I did have one jar completely pop its top, which is kind of a bummer. I thought the jar was broken, but I haven't gotten in there to look at it. It doesn't look like it's broken. It looks like the top just came off. So let's get these jars out of here. Just place them over here on this towel to completely cool. Yep, so there's the one jar. Now it did not break. The jar is fine. The lid just popped right off. So I don't know if I did not tighten it enough or if it came loose when it was being put in or when it was processing, but that's a bummer. But knowing the jar didn't break, I'm thinking I can probably salvage the food and feed it to the cats right now. But we do have 6 beautiful jars of homemade canned cat food, and I'm going to have to wash the outside of these jars because of what happened with the other jar, but these, we're going to let them cool and make sure that everything has sealed. Well guys, that's the recipe and process that I used to make homemade canned cat food. Besides helping us out in times of shortages like these, I'm sure it's healthier for our pets to give them homemade food. As long as you're following a recipe that takes into account their nutritional needs, it's always better to have homemade. We can control what goes into it and have complete control over the process. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave me a fish emoji. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our upcoming content. I'm Jara with Wicked Prepared. Survive today, thrive tomorrow. We'll see you next time. He gives the best hugs.